So we're in the middle of Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments, were given to God's people, to a new nation that He has just redeemed, to guide them and to help them as they establish this new identity, embracing this new identity as being the Israelites. They weren't called Israelites before. This is the first time that they're brought together to be a nation called Israel. And God provided them with such a grace. And we've seen this, that the Ten Commandments are not strict rules to restrict their movement. But then commandments are given as means of grace, as God's love for them, and how to live well under the kingship of Yahweh. So in the past 2 weeks, we look at the applications of the Ten Commandments. And today we're going to continue on looking at that, but specifically we're going to look at the heart of this King Yahweh, God Himself. We're going to look at His heart as He deliver and give His people the Ten Commandments. So this is what it means to hear or to look at the heart of God. What does it mean? God reveals His heart to His people. What does it mean? It means this. When you meet someone new and you introduce yourself, what do you say about yourself when you introduce yourself? In a way, that's your way of revealing yourself to that person that you just met. I'm so-and-so, and what do you say about yourself? Do you say about your marital status? Do you say about what you do? What do you say? What you say initially reveals who you are, your identity, so to speak. So in this way, in this passage, we'll see God introduce Himself further in revealing His heart to His people. And one of the things, in the simplest form, yet deepest form, simple yet deepest, God introduced Himself to His people, His children, this new nation that He just brought together, as a compassionate God. Can you imagine of all so many things that God can describe Himself? Like when I introduce myself, I can say, "Hi, my name is Pastor Ferdy. I'm a pastor at Rock City." Or I'm Ferdy. I'm married to Poppy. Or I'm Ferdy. I have 3 kids. Out of all the options that God's have, He say that He is a compassionate God. It is very crucial for us to understand as followers of this King, to understand His heart, what is important to Him. We all heard the saying, like father, like son. In a way, God is revealing Himself, saying that I'm your Father, I'm compassionate, and you should be too. And He's teaching His people, this new nation, to be like Him. So we're going to look at 3 things this morning about compassion. So the 3 things are the reasons for compassion, the recipients of our compassion, and the resource for us to be able to be compassionate. So the reasons, the recipients, and the resource. So the reason. So in this passage, there's these 2 bookends that it's very clear. When you read the Bible, when you see this similar opening ending, you know whatever in between describing this bookend. It's like if you go to a bookshop and you read the cover of the book, it explains what it's about, and then you look at the back of the book and it tells you a little bit more about what's the book about. What contains in between is what the cover says. And in this way, we can understand this passage by looking at the bookends that is quite clearly listed for us, given for us. So the first one is Exodus 22, verse 21. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So that's the cover. And the end in Exodus 23, verse 9 says this: You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You read 2 different verses. But yet it has the same meaning. That we, God's people, should not oppress a sojourner. Now, this is important the first reason is this. Remember the prerequisites of the Ten Commandments? Before God gives them the commandment, God says this in Exodus 20, verse 2. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Before you do any of this commandment, before you can obey any of this that God laid out for you, God says, remember, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now, what God is saying in this passage, you shall not wrong a sojourner because you were sojourners. God says, you were just like them before. Now I have rescued you. Now it's your turn. So this is why I said, I think this is appropriate to say, God want to say, like father, like son. I'm a compassionate God and you should too. So God has shown compassion towards his people first, to the people of Israel. Now he said, you should do the same. You ought to live in the same way. You shall not wrong a sojourner or a stranger or a foreigner. In our context, perhaps an immigrant, people that we don't know, our neighbors. Now, why? The first reason is because simple. God says, because you were a sojourner yourself. Simple reason. When you look at who you are, honestly, then you can appreciate others better. Then you can appreciate God better, what God has done for you. A lot of people, ungrateful people, are because they do not spend time in reflecting on who they were and what God has done in their life. So first reason, God says, remember. So what does it mean when God says, because you were sojourners? God is reminding them, do not forget who you were. It means this. It means simply because we could easily forget things like this. And as we shall see later on in the book of Exodus, and in fact throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, the people of God tends to forget him. And when you forget who God is and who you were before God saved you and rescued you, we tend to worship other gods, as the people of Israel did. They tend to leave God, forsake God, and forget what God has commanded them to. So God says now, remember who you were. Do not forget, because you were sojourners in the land of Egypt yourself. So don't forget who you are. And this is not just Old Testament theme. For us, New Testament people who believes in Jesus, the Apostle Paul instructs the Christians in Ephesus with the same reason. So let's look at Ephesus, Ephesians 2, 11 to 12. So Christians, Ephesus, Paul says this, therefore, remember that one time you were Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision, by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands. So he said, remember. And then the second time he said again, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. See, the reason that Paul gives Christian is the same. Remember who you were. Remember who you were. So the first reason is because we were sinners, we were sojourners. So we can have compassion. So that's the first reason. The second reason is after God lays out how the people must treat sojourners, God gives them another reason. The reason is very simple. In verse 27, he said, for I am. So after all the instructions, God says, for I am compassionate. Remember, we explained this a couple of times before. When you read the word for, because, since, therefore, it simply tries to tell you the reason. Like here, after God gives them the instructions, God tells them, for I am compassionate. For I'm a compassionate God. Now, to be a Christian, to be God's people, is to be compassionate people. We cannot say like it's an optional thing. You cannot. We just can't. We got no choice but to be compassionate like our God. So to be an Israelite in this context is to be like Yahweh. That is to be compassionate. And in the same way, for you and I this morning, to be Christians, to call yourself a Christian is to be like our King. That is to be compassionate. See, Christianity is an internal personal faith that has an external impact, always. So how do you know someone is truly a Christian? You can't see people's heart, but you can see the external action. So though our faith is internal and personal with God, it has always an external impact in our life, a transformation that changes our attitude towards people, especially the vulnerables, towards how we deal with our finances. It has an external impact. Our internal change has an external impact. Now, this is why I believe a non-compassionate Christian or uncompassionate Christian is an oxymoron. It's contradictory. They don't belong together. Now, if you are to be so the message is clear. The reason's been laid out. If you need one reason, the one reason is because our God, the God that you worship, our Father, is compassionate. That's what God says, for I am compassionate. Do all these things. Now, so you are to be compassionate. I am to be compassionate. So because we are the recipient of that compassion of God, and we are the child of God, we are children of God. What if you are not compassionate though? So if you look at your life, you're being honest with your life, yeah, I give some time, my finances, but I wouldn't say I'm compassionate. Perhaps you say you're compassionate, but that, we have lots of blind side in our life. The best judge, if you're married, is your spouse of your character and who you are. Ask your spouse, am I compassionate? Right? Or imagine this, if you are to drop dead today, and in your funeral, people who know you best, how would they describe you? Would they describe you to be a compassionate person that have shown compassion towards them? That's why they're standing right there and testifying to everyone of your character. What would people say? If it is your funeral today, what would people say about you? How would people describe you? Now, sometimes it's useful. I think it's very helpful for us to reflect on this, to just fast forward to our funeral. Everyone should do this exercise. I think it's a healthy exercise because all of us will die one day, and we don't know when that time comes. It could be today, could be next week, could be next month, could be next year, could be in 10 years' time, could be in 20 years' time. We don't know. We just don't know. So just imagine yourself in your own funeral. What would you want people to say about you? As far as our God is concerned, God's want to hear that you are compassionate. For I am compassionate. That's what God says. So the external, our compassion, our actions, reveals really the reality, what's happening on the inside. When we are not compassionate in our life, we have not received or have not pondered or appreciate the compassion that we have received from God. We have not understood it well. In other words, is this: if you are not compassionate, the question is, if you're not compassionate, then what? What you should do? Well, you shouldn't try harder. I wouldn't recommend that. Let me just be more compassionate. That's the natural thing a Christian would do. It's like, the sermon, spoke to me. I need to be more compassionate. I need to be more generous. I'm going to do that. Stop. Before you do that, you gotta look, because the external actions of your life comes from the inside. If you just fake the action, it will drain you out. It will wear you down. There will come a time, one day you'll say, I have enough of this Christian stuff. I can't be bothered with this. Why am I giving so much time to the church? Why am I serving people? Why am I giving away so much of my finances that I earn with my own sweat and hard work to so many people that are so ungrateful? You'll come to that point if it's just a manufactured external actions that you do. Because you hear a sermon that we are to be compassionate and you say, I'm going to try harder. Trying harder is not the solution because your external actions comes from the internal transformation. So what you need is not to try harder because you won't fake it long enough. You won't be able to do that. What you need is to have this transformation in your life. As far as God's people, they need to experience God Himself, a compassionate God in their life. So the question for all of us is this: have you truly experienced the compassion of our God in your life? See, the 10 Commandments, we said, can be neatly, in a way, split into two parts. The loving God and loving people, right? So the first 4 is loving God and the last 6 is loving people. You cannot love people if you don't love God. You just can't. Well, you can for a while. You can fake it to your brothers and sisters, but deep down you have this resentment. Deep down, as soon as the person you love reject your love, the person that you are generous with, ungrateful to you, you'll despise them. It's easy for us to give and to be generous, to love people who are grateful to us, who love us, who like us. But everyone else can do the same. You don't have to be God's people to do that. You don't have to be Christians to do that. Just pick any random person on the road. Everyone can do that. So how can you love people? It's not to manufacture your action, to fake it until you make it. But that is to love God first and foremost. So without the love of God, your love for people will be such a chore in your life. You'll be dreading in your service to God. You'll be so heavy when you put that, when these days you don't put money in offering anymore, even though we do at the back, we don't even pass it along anymore. So your heart will be so heavy when you click that transfer, or when you schedule regular transfer. You feel like, man, this is so difficult. Because deep down you don't love God. You just want all the benefits that it comes by loving God. What can God give me? What can obedience to God, how can obedience to God benefits me? See, when you love God, all the things that you do is not to gain anything, but because you have gained so much, because you have received so much. It's overflowing in your life that you do all that things. So when you love someone, when you are generous to someone and that person is ungrateful to you, you say, won't bother me. I'm generous and I'm kind and loving to that person. It's not because I want that person to do the same, for I have received more than enough from the Lord. So without the love of God, your love and my love will be such a chore that we'll not be able to sustain it. Sooner or later, it will weigh you down. It will weigh you down. And I've seen many of these in people's life who just... So if you don't give up, let's say you manufacture, if you don't give up, you become such a Pharisee. You look down on other people. You become so proud with your ability to obey. There's no humility in you. It's like, man, I read my Bible every day. I read cover to cover every year. How many times have you read your Bible cover to cover? So don't talk to me about the Bible. You look down your nose on other people if you're successful in obedience. And when you fail, you feel so wretched. You feel so guilty. You feel so condemned. The way is to love God and to seek Him. So that's reasons. Second thing is recipients of compassion. Everything we read between the two bookends, it's about being compassionate toward other people. Okay? A lot of times we are compassionate towards ourselves, isn't it? If you're married, you try to tell your spouse that, how much you need compassion. But these two book end explaining about being compassionate, not towards yourself, but towards others. Now let's read again from Exodus 22, verse 21 to 27. It's a bit long, but I think it's important for us to read this. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him. You shall not exact interest from him. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. See, this is outrageous because you lend someone money, you say don't take interest, but if people give you plates, the poor give you plates, return that plate within the same day before the sun goes down. What's the point of having or taking a pledge? There's no point, is it? So in a way, God is saying, don't even bother taking the pledge. You don't need any guarantee because I am your guarantor, God says. For you have received more than what you lend, what you can give out. A lot of these, if you read carefully, it's quite ridiculous. Not only in those days, but in our days today. That's what God says. And three groups of people quickly that God addressed here are the first one, verse 21, are sojourners or foreigners, in our case, immigrants, perhaps, but could be others. And the second group of people are widows and orphans in verse 22. And the third group of people, the recipients are the poor, verse 25, 27. How many of these people, if you're Christians, I want to talk to you. How many of this group of people are in your life daily that you are being compassionate towards? How many? Do you have any? That you consciously, diligently, obeying God in being compassionate towards this group of people? See, these are not merely a set of rules from God. These are God's heart. God says, for I am compassionate. So when you break these rules, that is not just a set of rules. You're not just breaking rules. You're breaking God's heart. See, the problem with us, we don't do it because we think we're just breaking God's rules. One of God's rules. But no, God is saying, this is my heart towards the poor, towards the widow, towards the sojourners. When you break this, you're breaking my heart, God says. Are you breaking God's heart daily? Notice two things in this rule. Like, before this passage, if you read, God didn't speak in this way. Now He changed the way He talks to His people. He says, you shall do this, you shall do that, you shall do that. And then He also says, and I will, if you're not, or if you do. That's a language of covenant, a personal God towards His own people. And this is how important it is. It's not a set of general rules for anybody to adopt. This is a set of rules for God's own people. That's why God says, you shall, and I shall. So these are rules that are not just any rules, but these are God's heart that He reveals to His people, the Israelites. Now, so that is the nature of this language here, these rules here, this law. But notice also the seriousness of this, so that we don't take this lightly. Let's look at verse 23 and 24. If you do mistreat them, if you don't obey, basically, if you do mistreat these people, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. Do you think God takes this lightly when he says this? You can say, oh, that's the Old Testament. We're living in the New Testament. Isn't God is the Alpha and Omega? He who never changed? You think God is the Old Testament care about the poor and the widow and the sojourners, and now he doesn't care about them? Do you think God took it seriously then, and now I can't be bothered? It's fine if you do. It's okay if you don't. No. It is just as serious today as it was back then, because God is never changed. This is the heart of God, you see. So how do you treat these people, this group of people in your life? Can you say that I treat this group of people in my life with much generosity? Can you say that? Honestly? When it comes to generosity, see, this is nothing I want to define. When it comes to generosity in the Bible, it is never moderate. It's never moderate. It's even more extreme in the New Testament if you claim to be a New Testament people, right? We are New Testament people, saved by grace alone, not by works. Our obedience doesn't change us. Even back in the Old Testament, right? The obedience to the Ten Commandments doesn't save them. God said, I've already saved you. I already rescued you out of Egypt, out of slavery. Now obey this. So our obedience doesn't save us. It's precisely because we are saved that we obey. So, how's your generosity? See, according to the Bible, and more extreme in the New Testament, generosity is never moderate. It's always excessive. So if your answer to my first question is like, have you been generous to this group of people? If your answer is yes, then the next question is, has your generosity been excessive? Or moderately safe? I think most of us, if we are honest, if we are generous, I hope we are, I hope you are, then oftentimes I could say our generosity is moderate. It's on the safe level. In the Bible, it's never safe. It's always extreme, always excessive. See, biblical generosity is never just give a small amount of what you have, time or money or whatever it is, that is disposable to you. So a lot of times when we're generous with people, when we give our time or money, they are disposable to us. Time that we could afford or money that we could afford to give and to lose. Biblical generosity always demands a sacrifice. It's always demand inconvenience. See, oftentimes we are kind to people because it's convenient to us. Let me take you home, you're on the way. Right? When biblical generosity demands a sacrifice. That means like, okay, I'm going south and you're way north, but I'm going to do that. That's what I mean by excessive. They're not disposable. It's not like I got $1,000 that I do not know what to do. It's a tax return money. I never planned in my budget. I lodged my tax return, I got this money. They're disposable. Biblical generosity is beyond that. It always requires sacrifice. It's always excessive. Now, how can you tell that your generosity is excessive? It's biblical generosity. Simple. Does it hurt when you do that? Does it hurt? When you have to drive 20 kilometers up north and then come back and then go back down another 20 kilometers to your home. When the petrol is over $2 per liter, right? I remember when I first moved to Australia back in '95, it was 60 cents. So it's so cheap back then. I know some of you are older than me, and you probably say, "Well, it was 20 cents when I first learned how to drive." I don't know, but I remember when I was in uni, it was 60 cents. So to drive people now, it's to drive your friend could be costly, could be expensive. I have to think twice. Sometimes when we recently moved, right? So a lot of you know, when we live so close here, when my family is late, I just say, I'm going to drive first. You drive the other car. I can't wait for you. Now we're living so far, and the petrol is $2. I say like, oh man, I have to wait for these guys. We cannot afford to drive 2 cars to church. It's just too costly. Does it hurt? That's a test. Does it hurt? When you give your time, when you give your finances, does it hurt? Does it affect you? Or it's just disposable? So if you only give what you can spare, then it's a good thing, but it's not a biblical giving yet. It's not a biblical generosity yet. It's something that any other people would do the same. Any other charity organization would do that. See, giving away for the stuff that you don't want, it's easy. But giving away the stuff that you like, now that hurts. Now, if you do it, this is what it means. When you give in that way, when you're being generous in that way, this is what it means. When you do that, then there's something else that you can no longer do. So, for example, a simple example that I gave you, if you drive someone up north, there's something that you cannot do. You have less time now. You cannot go home straight away. You cannot save the petrol. You cannot do. It costs you. There's something that is taken away from you because it's not disposable, you see. Say, give you a couple of examples. Say you've been saving up to buy a car for a few years. You've been diligently putting away money into a bank account to save up car. Then, just when you are about ready, you have enough to buy that car or that iPhone 14 that you've been saving up for, that costs an arm and a leg. Then you meet someone who needs the money more than you need to buy a car or a new phone, a new bag, or whatever it is. Giving that money that you've been saving up for means you cannot buy what you planned for with that money. It costs you something. That's not disposable. That's one example. When you do it, means you cannot do what you plan to do with it anymore. For example, every year, instead of saving up for a car or a thing, you're saving up for a holiday. That's the thing that we do after COVID especially, right? You want to go on holiday, we've been saving up, especially forced saving up during 2 years. You can't go anywhere. You've been accumulating this money. Now you can travel in luxury, perhaps even because you haven't been traveling. And then you met someone who needs that. That means you say, man, after 2 years, I cannot go on holiday. If I do this, then I have to delay my holiday again because I cannot afford to go if I've given this up. That's what it means to be excessive in your generosity. Or if you own a business, for people who own a business, who run a business, it may mean that you need to close a day out of 7 days, perhaps on the day that is the busiest day, the best time for your business. We got friends who owns hospitality business where they have to close on Sunday because their commitment to God. And on Sunday, when you own cafe, it's one of the busiest time for them. It costs them something. If you close one day for God, it's Sabbath, on one day, on the slowest day, it hasn't cost you anything. That's disposable. You only lose 2 customers, 3 customers, no big deal. But imagine out of 7 days, you own a business, out of 7 days, that one day is the most customers, the most income you're going to get, and that's the one day that you close. God says in Exodus 22, verse 29 to 30, in this way about our generosity. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest. That's excessive. Not from your side disposable saving account after you enjoy and spend most of it. But God says, you shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your son shall give to me, not the leftover, the first one, the one that will inherit. So in those days, only the first son will inherit everything. Say, your first son you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. The best of your animals you shall give to me. The best and the fullness of your harvest shall be given to me. And then in the New Testament, there are so many examples. I'm going to give you 3. The first one is the poor widow. In Mark 12. And this is Jesus. And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put it 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciple to him, and he said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box, for they all contributed out of their abundance, out of their disposal income, saving, whatever it is. But she, out of the poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. If you have 24 hours free day and then you give half of it, in biblical standard, that is not biblical generosity. If you have 1 free hour a week and you give that 1 free hour, that is biblical generosity. And second example is Zacchaeus. So a tax collector, a corrupt tax collector who met Jesus, and his life was transformed through his encounter with Jesus. And he said this in Luke 19, verse 8. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my goods I'll give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will restore it 4 times, 4-fold. He could just return it. If I defraud this person, I will just return it, I'll pay interest. He said, no, I'll pay back 4-fold. And of all my money, I give half of it away. Another one, rich young ruler, a rich ruler came to see Jesus. He said, I want to inherit eternal life. So let's look at this. Luke 18, what must I do? He said. So a ruler asked Jesus, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said to him, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness, honor your father and mother. Those are 10 commandments, by the way. And he said, all these I have kept from my youth. He said, I've done all that. The rules he's done. But what he missed is the heart of Christ, of God, you see. So he said, I've done all the rules. For him to break that, he's just breaking rules. He don't understand that this is God's heart. So that's why Jesus said, and he said, all this I've done to my fruit. And Jesus heard this and he said to him, one thing you still lack. Sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come and follow me. I stopped right there because how it ends is not pretty. You can read it yourself. This ruler didn't say, I would gladly do that if I can have you. He did not. For Christians, sometimes it's easy to follow rules. It's easy to follow rules, but to follow Jesus, to give your heart to Jesus, that's a lot harder. You can be obedient on the outside, but you can be rotten on the inside. Because in your obedience, you seek God for His blessing and His gifts rather than you want Him in your life. So how generous are you? Do you have this this standard of biblical generosity in your lifestyle, in your life? If an accountant would come and audit your finance, what would this accountant auditor find? What would he declare? Guilty or not guilty? What would they say? God said in Exodus 23, verse 19, the best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. The best you shall bring to God. Because of COVID, we stopped the act of giving in church. I love, to be honest, personally, I love that rituals of coming to God and giving to God as an act, as a physical act. But now we do transfers because of more safe, more hygienic, and all the stuff. But there's this point to it of these habits and rituals, this rhythm in life that we must practice in our life. Otherwise, we will not do it in our life well. It will just a chore for us. It's just rules for us. It doesn't come from our heart. So what do you bring to the Lord this morning in your life? Just disposable? Out of everything that you have, you lay it down before God. The third thing, the resource. I hope you get a sense that this is not an easy thing to do. In fact, it is an impossible thing to do. I hope you get that sense. I don't want you to go home here. If I stop here, it's like, yeah, I'm doing that already. That's easy for me. I hope you don't feel that way. But God didn't leave his people without resource or tools to do this. God said, and this is important as well, to read this verse 13 that we like to miss. Pay attention, God says, after all the things that he said. He said, pay attention to all that I have said to you. Not some that I've said to you. Not most of what I've said to you. But all that I've said to you. Everything that I've said to you, pay attention to them. Obey them. Do them. Why? Why this is so important? Because partial obedience is disobedience. 99% faithfulness is unfaithfulness. See, young people, you may not understand this, but if you're married, try to tell your spouse, I'll be 99% faithful to you. See where you sleep. See where you end up. It doesn't work. Same with following God. God say, all that I've said, you must obey. You break one, you break half. You break everything. Even this young ruler, they say, I've done all that. But he missed the heart of God. God, he's lost. Even though he said, from my youth, from very young age, I've done all this, Lord. But he missed God's heart. So now, remember, now we know the seriousness of this matter before our God, a compassionate God. This is a non-negotiable, non-optional. God says, you shall or I will. You see that? You shall do this or I will do this to you. It's serious. What did God say? I will kill you with a sword. Now, I hope you get to a point like me at this point. How on earth can I live like this? There's no way I could live in this way. I hope you ask the same question. How can I do this? Lord, I've been saving up to pay to get that house, I'm about to get married, I'm going to start a family. I've been saving up. Like, how can I do this? I've got 3 kids. How can I do this? How on earth can I live like this? Well, God give us the resources. The first thing God give us is this, remember. So that's the first resource, remember. What should we remember? We should remember the gospel, the good news that we have received from God. That's our resource to be. When you remember that you were once fatherless, God adopted you. Or when you were a widow and He became your groom. God said, Christians, when you come to me, you'll become my groom. I'll become your groom. You be my bride. And when you were strangers, when you were enemies of God, God brought you home. Who brought enemies home? Nobody. You brought friends home. You brought family home. But God brought strangers and enemies like you and me home. God said, remember that. That's the gospel. Remember the gospel. And only then you have the resource to be outrageously compassionate and biblically generous. Remembering what God has done is the resource for us to do this. Now, parents, I want to speak to you. If you have children, you must teach your children not just to be generous, but to be biblically generous. To teach your children to give away their toys that they no longer play, that's easy. Any other kids will do that, especially if you promise them, if you go away your toys that you don't play, then I can get you some more. Then you have more space for new toys. That's easy. But if your parents teach your kids biblical generosity, teach your kids about sacrificial giving, not from their disposal. Perhaps it's the newest toy that they have. Perhaps the toy that you have promised them, hey, kid, son or daughter, I've saved this money up to buy this toy that you want. But hey, we met this person that needs this. Let's use this money that we have saved up to buy what you want for this person, which means you cannot have what you want. Teach them that. That's biblical giving. That's biblical generosity. So how do you do that as parents? Well, if they're very young, you model it. You live in such a way. And you explain it to them why you do it. When you can't go on holiday that year or that month or whatever it is that you promised them, you explain to them why they can now. You say, but you promised. I know I promised, but we can no longer do that because of this. Explain to them. You model it to them. That you're living a life that is sacrificial according to the Bible. Biblical generosity. Model it. And if they're older, you do it together with them. You partner with them. And if they're older still, and they haven't done this, you would instruct them. So, sometimes, as I said before, it's easy for us to do this, to be compassionate towards people who are grateful to us. But God says, do this to enemies. In verse 4 and 5, this is not an accident. There's a funny one in there, but this is serious. God put it in there. Verse 4 and 5, if you meet just not any one ox, it says, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who, not neutral to you, hates you, lying down on his burden, you shall refrain from leaving with him it. You shall rescue it with him. Why God bother to add the extra details? God could have just said, if you meet your neighbor's ox, or if you see a donkey of one of your neighbors, say no. If you meet your enemy's ox, if you meet the donkeys of the one who hates you, who just backstabbed you yesterday, who just stole your promotion, who just talked back behind really bad gossip behind you, show love and compassion and generosity to those people. That's what God says. To help a friend in need is normal, but to love an enemy is biblical. Anyone can love a friend, be generous to a friend, but that's only get you to the same like anyone else. Jesus said this, and let's read from Luke 6. Let's see if I got Luke 6 here. Okay, Luke 6, 27, 36. 27 to 36. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good, and lend expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Again, that language of you're my children, I'm your Father, you should be like me. Why we should be merciful and compassionate? Because God says, I am merciful. God says, I am compassionate. That should be enough reason for us to do what He says. So one of the best way of learning is for children especially to see it being modeled in parents. Now, but God knows we fail. If you don't feel like you're such a failure now, then I failed to do my job. Because that's my goal. To make you feel like you're such a failure in doing this. Because I feel the same when I read God's Word. How comprehensive it is, how outrageous it is, how excessive it is. See, our accountants, if they're honest, if it is, Jesus chartered accountant, not just any accountant, if Jesus chartered accountant audit your finances, he would say this: guilty, guilty, guilty. Therefore, just as parents, the best way to teach your children to model it for us, God did the same for you and me. He didn't just lay down the rules, He modeled it for you and me. On that cross, Jesus, who owned everything, He gave it up for you and me. On that cross, He gave it all up. That's sacrificial generosity at its best. When you look at the cross of Christ, when you see Jesus nailed to the cross, you cannot get any better than that. You cannot get any outrageous and excessive than that when it comes to compassion and generosity that any parents could give and model to their children. When God says, do this, because I am merciful, because I'm compassionate, what He's saying here is, look to my Son nailed to that cross. So when we fail, Jesus succeeds. When we fail to love our neighbors with sacrificial generosity, Jesus died for His enemies. When He won everything, the splendor of heaven, and He exchanged that for a smelly animal bed. He could afford everything. He gave it all up so that you and I, who couldn't do this, have the tool and resources to do this. For we have received far beyond what we could ever imagine or hope for to receive. And let me close with this verse. And then we're going to sing. And we're going to look to the cross as we partake the Holy Communion. And see how Jesus modeled it for us. So let me read this last verse for all of us to close. So to the Christian in Ephesus, Paul says this. Paul exhorts them in this way. In Ephesians 5, 1 and 2. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. Model before me. And walk in love as Christ loved us and gave Himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. If you want the resource, you want to know how to do it, there's no other way but to look to the cross. Look at what Christ has sacrificed for you and me today. Let us pray.